Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow and Director of the Iran Program here at the Middle East Institute in Washington, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's discussion of the award-winning Nasrin documentary, which is about a Iranian human rights activist and political prisoner by the name of Nasrin Soutoudeh. MEI's Iran program is a source of analysis on a host of issues relating to Iran, from US-Iran relations to Tehran's regional policy agenda to the state of Iran's economy and civil society. We strive to provide timely and in-depth analysis for those interested in Iranian affairs. In that effort, we believe that one of the most intriguing and often underexplored aspects of life inside Iran is the role of Iranian women in society. Nasrin, the individual, and Nasrin, the documentary, is a powerful reminder of the often groundbreaking efforts of Iranian women. Today's discussion will be moderated by Middle East Institute's own non-resident scholar, Nazee Moinian. Nazee will introduce our guests and lead the discussion, and I will look forward to join the panel as well. Just a few more words in terms of housekeeping before I hand it over to Nazee. Just to remind everyone to please submit your questions by using Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. Please feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. Nazee will be looking at all those questions and will factor in as many of those questions as possible during the discussion. And with all that said, Nazee, this virtual floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I realize how busy your days are, and we feel honored that you have joined us. So I'm delighted to present to you my two favorite people, Jeff Kaufman and Marcia Ross, the heroes of this movie, besides Reza and Nasrin Soutoudeh, of course, and many others who have undertaken the task of creating this documentary for all of us to see. It's very timely. It's International Women's Week. And with that, since Alex already has done the bios online and you can look at the bios, I will delve right into the Q&A. I know time is of essence. So good morning, Jeff and Marsha. I believe you're in West Coast, and yeah, it's kind of early, but I know you're early risers. So I'm going to start with both of you, either one of you, with the question that I think you've been asked many, many times over, and for the right reasons. You have, as two Americans, you have been interested, taken the challenging task of creating this documentary against all odds. Why? Why Nasrin Soutoudeh? And tell us how it came about. And when we get through those, then I'll ask more questions.
I can start. My turn?
Yes.
Okay. We alternate on this answer, so.
I'm sure.
But actually we alternated on everything on this film, and it's been a wonderful journey. Imagine, we're married, we work together, and we've had this wonderful relationship with Nasrin Soutoudeh and her husband Reza Khandan across 7,500 miles, and to develop not just a working relationship for the film, but for a friendship as well, is just remarkable. And I just want to say, Nazee, you were mentioning, we all have busy days, and I can't tell you how many times throughout the day I think, what is Nasrin doing right now? We've had her husband's described the cell she's in, and I think sometimes political prisoners, people far away, seem so abstract. And to carry with you each moment the struggle of someone like Nasrin and the reality of someone like that is just inspiring and motivating. It was about 2016 when Marsha and I were finishing up our last film, which was about the history of Broadway and this great playwright, Terrence McNally, that we reached out to Nasrin to see if we could do a documentary about her. We'd known about her work for years. I had done 3 or 4 other films about Iran over a decade or so, including one about the persecution of the Baha'i faith in Iran that was with Amnesty International. And sort of building on those contacts, and both feeling that Nasrin represents so many incredible things for the world. She's this women's rights activist. She believes in human rights. She's someone who crosses religious borders and ethnic borders to believe that we're all united and we all deserve a fair shake in society. She's a great campaigner against the death penalty. So for us, she represented so much of what we need in this country and what Iran and the world needs as well. And we asked if we could do a documentary about her. We shared a couple of shared goals at the beginning. One was, she said, well, yeah, if it can be also through me about, all these other activists as well. And that was always our vision. We wanted to create a sense of community. And then also right at the front, Marsha and I wanted to use this as a way to pay tribute to the Iranian people and to realize there's a difference between governments and people. And Iran has this, as you know, it has this incredibly rich culture and history and a vibrant daily life and social society. And we wanted that to come across in the film as well. Unfortunately, she said yes. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that we were able, speaking about heroes, we were able to work with these incredible filmmakers in Iran who could get access that we couldn't get to cover Nasrin in so many different ways. And so, that started this journey, and it won't be complete though until she's out of prison and many others like her out of prison as well.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. Marsha, tell us about. You and I have spoken through the years, through the past 2 years when you were editing the movie. This is kind of a tangential question, but I'm going to ask it right off the bat. What moments in the movie stood out for you as a woman, and what moments didn't get into the final editing that you wish you had? Because it's just so much time that you can make a movie with.
Yes, well, to answer the second part of the question, one of the main things we wanted to do is create a fully rounded portrait of this woman, activist, mother, lawyer, wife, intellectual, extraordinary, strategic mind. And so, when you make a film, you're always trying to sort of balance the how you're going to create this character. I have a long time background as a casting director in narrative film. And so, you look at, who should be the lead of your movie. You want someone who's a compelling character and also someone who's is not one dimensional. So in trying to find that balance, we had to make sure that we told a lot of aspects of her life and didn't get too heavily on her politics. We showed her as or too heavily into one, too many cases. So in that regard, it's difficult because, she's involved. We weren't able to really talk about her work with LGBT, cases and environmental cases. So we just couldn't get all that in. I think there's so many, by the way, there's so many moments that stick out to me. I always talk about the one where she's picking Nima up from school and, he's his backpack and, and she's holding his hand and, you see her, talking and walking down the street. And I love the universality of that moment because I think as we've talked about in all our films and particularly in this film, we want to capture sort of the common humanity, of people that, we share that with people around the planet, we live in different countries, but human beings are human beings and mothers all over the world pick their children up from school. But there's other moments which I love to share and little things, little moments having watched the film over and over again. One of them was the scene when she's in the Revolutionary Court, where she ended up being, and they were just dismissing her. And the sort of the look on her face as her final sort of that look that came over her face, where she doesn't get angry, she doesn't blow up. She doesn't turn it into a scene. She actually just, she's very strategic. She knows when to push, when to stop. And for me, I saw that in her over and over again, in the phone call where she has with the, when the Baha'i kids are, and the way that she is dealing with the man that she's talking to on the phone. And that's sort of, you just sort of watch how she builds her case. And I think lastly, one of my other, and I've talked to him about it, is Reza, her wonderful husband, who I call sort of her Marty Ginsburg, the husband of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who equal partner, just as smart, you know, but really comfortable in the role of her husband and partner and supporting her work. And, you know, when he talks about, you know, when he met her and when he asked her to marry him, and the, you know, the smile that he has on his face, you know how much he loves this woman. And, you know, those are the things. But I think the way she handles herself with every different person, and, you know, is very controlled and strategic in her responses. It's all very subtle. But when you make a film and you're in editing and you watch things hundreds of times, you know, you pick up lots of different things each time. And I think a lot of times the subtlety of, you know, the expression on her face really comes through.
Thank you for that. Actually, I don't know how many times I've watched this movie, probably 10 times. And each time I come away with a different message. This time, interesting enough, it's the same scene with Mr. Shariat Maduri at the court where he's dismissing her. And the remark was translated in English as good riddance, but in Farsi, it's even more disparaging. It's something like, go fly your kite, or, you know, go find your black bean in a haystack, or something remarkably shallow and dismissive for such a wonderfully high-powered and intellectual woman. Alex, I'm coming to you. Thank you for joining us today. I mean, this is your platform, actually, Iran's foreign policy, civil society, as a director at the MEI. I wanted you to tell us more about, I wanted you to tell us more about the demography, not something that you can find in CIA stat book, but the Iranian woman versus the Iranian man, the level of education, their aspirations and dreams. Are they in touch with you directly from Iran? And if you can just fill in the little holes from people who have seen the movie and want to know more about the Iranian women.
Oh, thank you, Nazee John. That's a big question. I will be brief, but thank you for hosting, and thanks to Marsha and Jeff for joining us, and congratulations for this wonderful, wonderful, compelling documentary, which I could not recommend enough. I mean, I really enjoyed watching it, learned a lot. And I was a bit ashamed, actually, when I watched it, because I mean, Mrs. Soutoudeh, as an Iran watcher, I've been doing this over 20 years, watching Iran daily. We're so preoccupied with centrifuges and anti-air missiles and this and the other that we lose sight of some of the people involved in this. And this story about a very brave lady and a brave family, brave husband, and frankly, brave children who've gone through a lot. You know, I watched that and I felt a bit bad, because I'm sitting here in my comfort zone in Washington, D.C., and I see that what people are doing to improve the lives of themselves and their people, which is what Nasrin Soutoudeh is doing. So again, a wonderful documentary. I had all sorts of emotions, I have to be honest, when I watched this. I grew up in Europe, and this took back to the 1980s in Northern Europe, when, you know, my parents' generation, they were proud of their Iranian heritage. They were proud to go around the world. My generation, we were kids growing up having to, explain what the Ayatollahs were doing. And it was, you know, as a child, it was many moments of embarrassment, frankly. And some of the things you know, lashing a human being. I mean, how do you, I mean, on a personal level, it was tough. It took me back to those days where I just wanted to be somebody else oftentimes. On a professional level, as I said, I had this issue where I said to myself, good for Marsha and Jeff, what a documentary they're making, but does this really matter? I mean, and why is Nasrin doing this? Why does she think as a lawyer in the Islamic Republic, she can do anything? I mean, the Islamic Republic is famous for having created this number of institutions to give it the sort of facade that people's power is in action. Everyone knows that the judiciary doesn't have any control over things that really matter, because there's one individual pretty much who decides, and that's the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And, you know, those judges could do whatever compromises with Nasrin Soutoudeh. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei doesn't want to compromise with his own people. He's on a different mission. He wants to, you know, elevate his own role, not in Iran, because if he cared about that, he would make compromises with demographics inside of Iran, including women, but he's in the region. He's in Syria, he's in Lebanon, he's in Iraq, he's elsewhere, on a whole different mission, which I think, you know, if he's not careful, will come to bite him. But Nazee John, on your point about Iranian women as a demographic, I don't have to remind anyone who watched the documentary, or you, Iranian women have been at the forefront of this for over 120 years now, going back to the Constitutional Revolution 1906. This is not a demographic that sits there and takes it. This is a very educated, today over 60% of university graduates in Iran, despite all the limitations that the regime wants to put on them, are graduating. The graduation part is actually the easy part. Once they come to society, then they have to see what they qualify for jobs. And one of the things that the regime has done is to try and limit them, because they frankly fear women power. You know, when you talk about the veil or not allowing women, I should say compulsory veil, it should be by choice. If you want to have the veil on, I totally respect that. But the compulsory veiling, that's a different story. And that's what we've seen movement after movement over the last 42 years since this regime was born in 1979, people trying to stand up. And frankly, Nasrin does a very good job in making that distinction between the personal space and the public space, I think, in the documentary. But where we are in reality, certainly with the younger generation of Iranian women, they're not satisfied with that anymore. They really want to go out there, because the veil is just a one instrument to keep them down. And, I give you one example. I'll stop, Nazee, because I could go on, and I don't. I want to hear Marcia and Jeff. But when you as a regime get into business of limiting how many Iranian women at universities can study human rights, or can study English, or can study social sciences, that's not a random decision. That's a decision that tells me this is a political system that fears women, that believes empowered women will come after them, ask for questions, ask for rights. And by the time, if the regime decides to give some of these concessions to them, the regime will have inherently changed its makeup as a political system. And they don't want to go there. That's why they're putting all these limitations in place of human rights activists and do what they do. I mean, 38 years for what Nasrin Soutoudeh has done. And what has she done? What are these crimes? I mean, you talk about Hossein Shariat Madari, the infamous editor of Kayhan newspaper, which is a mouthpiece of Ayatollah Khamenei. Where was the evidence of anything he said?
Right,
Have
exactly.
they ever produced any of the evidence? Anyway, so I'll stop, Nazee.
Yeah, no,
Well,
but
can I add something to what Alex just said, if that's okay?
yes.
You were talking about this incredible power of women in Iran and how the leadership is afraid of that power. I think someone we spoke to at one point said that they're trying to generate anger in men against women to keep their own sense of power. But I just wanted to point out that you're right. I mean, you see in the film, in the 1 million signature campaign sequence, where these women are using the tools of grassroots democracy to demand their rights in this incredibly inspiring way that should be very powerful in the United States as well. And you see that huge potential. But a World Bank Global Equality Index was released 2 years ago that ranked Iran out of 187 countries. It ranked Iran 185 as far as women's actual equality was concerned. It was only behind Saudi Arabia and Sudan. So if you think of all that incredible power and talent and potential to lift Iran to the level that it should be and wants to be, and then women in that country's their equality is 185 out of 187 countries. What a wasted potential, and what a cruel fate for those women.
Can I also say, Alex, you touched upon two things. I don't mean to interrupt, but Nasrin says that, that's another moment where she holds the thing and she says, this piece of cloth, it's like, it doesn't matter if they tell us we can't wear it, because they're still telling us what to do. I think that's a very powerful moment. But, people often ask this question about, how does she do this? I mean, I am a mother. I don't know, that I could do this with my life, and with the, going to prison for the rest of my life and never seeing my children for a cause. And I think as we were making the film, this was a question I really needed answered. I did need it answered for myself to really, truly understand Nasrin and what drove her. Unfortunately, although we couldn't go to Iran to film because it was too dangerous for us, we did go around the world and interview all the other people in the film. So I did really get a chance to get to know other women activists, and also others that aren't in the film that we've come to know, and actually get to ask this question. And it's hard to really sort of understand, but true believers, Nasrin is a person who was trying to change the world for her children and make it a better place, and for other people's children, and for the future women of Iran. And it's a calling that she has that's sort of greater than thinking, well, I'm abandoning my children, or this is a sacrifice. In fact, I think they feel it's the opposite. To not do it is the sacrifice, as opposed to I'm sacrificing my children, my life. And, fortunately with Nasrin and her family, they understand their mother, they support their mother. They understand why she's doing it. I think they're very proud of her. I know it's hard on the family, but they get it. And I mean, and that was something, it's hard to really understand it, isn't it? But so many things, but this is what she thinks.
I mean, I don't want to pivot away from Nasrin, and thank you for actually elaborating more on this, because you covered many of the questions I had. But I wanted you guys to talk about Reza. It seems to me that Iran is a land of Nasrins, having grown up in Iran as an Iranian Jew. So I had my own sort of challenges. But Reza deserves his own documentary, doesn't he? And I wanted to find out, are you still in touch with him? I know he had a sentence of 6 years in prison, which is suspended. And I want you to tell us how you've connected with him. Jeff, you as a spouse, as a man, both logistically and emotionally, and then Marcy, whatever you can tell us on how you've dealt with Reza.
Yeah. I'll tell you how I've dealt with it.
That's the panel for today, but maybe we can do another panel with Jeff.
It's so complicated. Well, we're in touch with Reza several times a week. Us and we just adore him, and we adore Nasrin. It's funny. They're such remarkable people and so courageous, but they'll both just say, "Hey, we're ordinary folks. We're just ordinary people. We love each other, and we're doing what we have to do." There's so many times I could say I'll never forget, but I'll never forget when Nasrin was released from prison for the first time on her medical leave. She's had 2 medical leaves since she was arrested in June 2018. The first was after she had this 46-day hunger strike, which was calling for political prisoners to be released from prison because they were in these COVID-affected prisons. And 46 days, your body breaks down, and she had a bad heart anyway. Anyway, she was released from prison very, very briefly. Marsha and I just talked to her and Reza like the day after she got out. And it was like so many conversations we've had where they were just so funny. It's just, I wish I could put you in the conversation, asking how we're doing, how are your kids, making jokes. And then Nasrin clicks into that very serious, I'm going to change the world mode too. And that's also Reza. They're just great partners. And I said before that one of our goals for the film was to sort of fight this demonization of Iran and this demonization of the Iranian people. And I think no one better does that than Reza, who's this, a Muslim man who believes in rights of women and fights for his wife and is putting himself on the line to make his country better. What great role models.
So the is that we're in touch with him quite a lot. It's been really wonderful, actually. We've gotten to know him, the last few years, because, obviously Nasrin was arrested while we were making the film. And so our main, relationship grew, with Reza, and has also continued to grow through the release of the film, because except for these 2 medical leaves, she's been in prison throughout this. And we have a lot of contact with him. He obviously keeps us up to date all the time with what's going on with her. We've shared messages. We've been able to get things out to the world, to the media, that she has wanted. But he's he's participated in a lot of things that we've done. A lot of these events that we've done, he's been able to come on. It's been pretty remarkable all the way from Iran. It's always the middle of the night for him, but he's there. He is, dressed and looking great, and such a good attitude. I'm sure it's really hard. I mean, he's very close to his kids, and they do have a really good family of support, which I don't think they could do any other way. I mean, if he has never expressed ever any thing, I would say, like distress or negative or anything about being separated from his wife. You know, he visits her all the time, he talks to her all the time, but there's never been anything ever that you feel critical or that he's not happy with the choices that she's made, just ever.
Yeah, just two quick things to add on to that. One is that if you haven't seen the film, it's not just about this human rights icon. It's also a love story. It's a love story between these two remarkable people. And hopefully, if you're in a relationship, it'll give you some good, relationship tips. But I also just think about Reza when Nasrin was in the hospital, oftentimes when she was in the Wien prison especially, he wasn't allowed to see her. But every time there was a visitor's day, he'd go there anyway, just so the authorities would know he'd show up. And even if they wouldn't let him see her, even if they couldn't connect, he'd go there each time because he was making a statement that I love this woman, I'm supporting her.
Yeah, I mean, and actually, we have to say that the film has been, really, I mean, Jeff and I talk about this all the time. I mean, for them, it's been such a positive thing. I mean, it's given, a lot of focus and energy and positivity to the family. This is an involvement and making all this noise about her is very, very important. I mean, as she says, our children shall not accept silence. I mean, it's become in some ways, very, very helpful to her that we've created all this noise through the film globally, but also just for them. I mean, it's something, that they're doing with us in partnership, and it's really pretty amazing.
Thank you for that. Alex, I want to bring this question to you. We're both students of foreign policy, and it seems to me that Iran is trying to have it both ways. It blames the West and holds West accountable for sovereignty, which is a Western conception, and respect for rule of law, international norms, but at the same time, it flaunts another Western conception, which is human rights, notwithstanding the Bill of Rights from Cyrus the Great. For those of you who will email me later and say, but we had Cyrus the Great 2,500 years ago, and he had the original Bill of Rights. Notwithstanding that, it seems that Iran wants to have the cake and eat it too. How do you deal with a regime that holds everyone else accountable but itself?
Nazee, before I get to that, which is a very interesting, important question, let me just remind you and myself and everyone who watched the documentary about, one part that really jumped at me and a comment I had. The part that jumped at me was the killing of the Baha'i individual with those two young brothers, I believe. To me, those two young men, I assume they're young, would not have been born in 1979. So how did they get to where they are today in terms of their worldview? Because it's not an Iranian worldview. That's not an average Iranian worldview. This is a new phenomenon. This is not what Iranians are known for.
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean when you say it's not an Iranian worldview?
That level of hatred for a religious minority, member of a religious minority. Iran is proud of its 5,000 plus civilization, which has meant that you've had minorities. Some of the earliest Christians were in Iran before Islam arrived. Jews have lived there for over 2,700 years. It's always full of ethnicities and various, in terms of dialects alone, we have over 50 dialects. This is a place that full of richness in that sense. So how do you end up with this black and white worldview in the minds of some of these young people? That's the product of the policies of the Islamic Republic. And Nasrin Soutoudeh talks about that when she talks about we need to change the culture. And I think that's a big part of the mission going forward. No matter what happens to the Islamic Republic, because who knows what happens to this regime, but the damage has been done. A lot of the young people in that country have grown up in conditions where they've been brainwashed into some of these beliefs that are really dangerous and will handicap Iran as a country in the global community. You just can't, which is, an issue that I want to use to link to your question about foreign policy. You cannot have it your way and claim that you want to be a good member of the, a member of good standing on an international stage. It's just not going to happen that way. I mean, how do you resolve that internationally? I mean, there are no quick fixes for this, but one of the best things you can do is to mobilize as much international support to pressure the Islamic Republic when they carry out injustices that we witness. So you really do I don't know if that's going to result in anything concrete in terms of them changing their policies, but at least that's what you need to do. For example, the European Union, the United States right now need to have human rights and what's going on in Iran as much bigger part of the conversation with Iran. Perhaps not in the first instance, because unfortunately we have Iran's nuclear program taken away and everybody wants to deal with that first. But somewhere along the line, you need to at least help the Iranian people help themselves. And again, there are ways you can do that, but there is this energy, there is this huge energy of about probably 85% of the Iranian population that want a different political system instead of the one they have today, right? How do you help them? How do you get their voices out? How do you let them express their views and opinions? And I think that's a big part of, the United States policy, Europeans going forward.
I want to stop you there because that kind of leads into the next question for both of you. You said that you've traveled around the world to speak to other dissidents and friends of Reza and Nasrin and other Iranian activists. I don't know if this was my perception or if the audience had the same feeling that the Europeans somehow feel closer to Iran as a culture and an entity than the Americans. Nasrin was given the Sakharov Prize by the European Parliament. And what we saw in America is just the start of the recognition of what Nasrin has done and what she stands for. Where do you see that difference between the European and the American approach? And how can we make the two of them meet on the same level?
Well, I mean, that's a two-part question. You should probably.
It always is.
Yeah. No, I want to just tell you from a filmmaker point of view, it is very interesting, that what you learn is how little Americans know about Iran, where internationally people know a lot more about Iran. Americans, we found really didn't know who Nasrin was here. I mean, she's not well known. Whereas, people in other countries, because we did our research, you see all these petitions and these protests. It was not easy to find a protest, that we could include in the film that was happening in the United States. It's interesting. And it's also been really interesting, and he'll answer the other part of the question, but when we first showed the film to people, and we just had friends over, to show the film. And we had some friends who were Iranian and came from Iran, were exiles, and our friends that are just friends, in the entertainment industry or, good friends and, knew nothing. And it was so interesting, like the response to the film, because it was really clear that our American friends, I mean, they knew nothing. They were so shocked by, how beautiful Iran was. Like, they didn't know anything. They'd never heard of Nasrin. Our Iranian friends were crying when they saw the movie, and how much we captured, the country that they remembered so well in this really positive way. So this is really big, it's a big dichotomy here, for, and even, getting support, outside, obviously it was hard to get support and we kept it secret, but, outside the Iranian community to help us make the film because people just didn't know who she was. You can answer the rest of that.
Well, I was also struck by something that Alex said that connects to, I think, what we're talking about. You were talking, Alex, about the ignorance and fear that is instilled in young people and how dangerous that is. And those young people might think it's their own idea bubbling up, but it's actually from some deeper, more scary source. And, we've seen the same thing in the United States. And we've seen it from the beginning of our history, which is that, people are told it's all about me and to hate the other and to use that as political leverage. It's very frightening in the United States right now. As we were making this film, we were seeing literally democracy under assault in the United States as we're portraying people fighting for democracy in Iran. I couldn't, when we were going to have an election, I was thinking, please be inspired by people in Iran if you're trying to decide to go vote or not, because here are people who are willing to die, or be arrested for the right to vote and to have their rights heard. And then we see, apathy in this country. So I think, a lot of these attitudes are universal, but it also points to there is weirdly enough, a kindred spirit between the United States and Iran that just hasn't really been heard. I remember the first documentary I did about Iran was when this wonderful Iranian American scholar, Hala Esfandari, was arrested. She was in her 60s. She went to visit her 90-year-old mother in Iran. And it was this horrible long story where they set her up for a robbery and took her passport, put her in a Wien prison. And I remember at the time reading the Iranian Constitution, which was not my usual kind of reading, but I was thinking, because Hala's view was, how can we bring these two cultures together? And there's big chunks of the Constitution that don't want that kind of mutual understanding, that fight against that kind of mutual understanding. And so it's a big abstract question, but this country cannot impose a political process on Iran, nor should we try, because it'll be counterproductive. I think that we have to push forward with the nuclear accords and realize that advocating human rights strongly is part of that process. But I just also hope that this film, the arts, and everything else we do can be a way of tearing down some of those barriers, because there's so many positive commonalities between these two countries that just go wasted. And yeah.
I believe that you agree, as I'm sure all of us do, and Curry's assessment that the Iranian regime and the Iranian people have nothing to do with each other. And she actually said they welcomed her with open arms in a way that she has never seen, having traveled around the world as a journalist.
Yes, just go to someone's house from Iran and have them offer you a meal. You realize what full generosity is.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, the graciousness of the Iranian people, that we've met's been, very high level of graciousness. One thing interesting about making the film, because as you know, most of the film is in Farsi, and then we have this English subtitles, and of course neither one of us speak Farsi. I've learned a few words since, but we don't speak it, and so it was a really interesting experience, doing it, through the editing process and also just the getting of the film, because the film came in different batches at different times. And so part of Jeff's process, because we had to get it out of the country and we never knew when we were getting it. So part of Jeff's process is first to log all the footage, all the clips, and number them, because that's really important for editing. And then we would watch it, but we didn't know what they were talking about. We just watched. And then we sent it off to our translators. We had a couple of wonderful translators we worked with who then translated what we saw. And then, of course, we then learned what we saw. And then, Jeff then created, sort of a working script from which we began to edit, for the original rough cut of the film, and we evolved it, but it starts with the script that he did. And then we had to go back and work very closely, with, again, our editor, who also did not speak Farsi, and our translator, and really match, what are people saying to people saying. But I think one of the really interesting things I also learned is that, one thing a person can say is like, that's a nice shirt. I mean, that can mean 15 different, like 7 different things when someone says you're wearing a beautiful shirt, and so you have to be very careful about how you really interpret what the real intention of the way that was said, which is we found true to the culture, which we learned. And, that was really interesting, trying to figure all that out, making the film. But again, we really immersed ourselves that way in the culture of Iran. And also I feel like, in the beauty of the country, we really also decided we wanted to capture what a gorgeous place it is.
Nazee and Alex, can I turn the tables on you for a moment and ask you a question?
You could do that. Let me just throw this last question, because I want to go to the audience. Sorry, Jeff, but I'm afraid that I will not get to the audience's questions for that. So this is basically, Jeff Allen has sent 2 comments. One is congratulating you on a wonderfully done documentary, which I couldn't agree more. And thank God for the 2 of you for having undertaken this and given us a new angle on Iran and Iranian women, and making us believe that things can be possible, hopefully. He wants to know, and this is a question I had, I wanted to know if you think this documentary is for or against more diplomacy with Iran. Does it support more diplomacy with Iran? And Jeff basically wants to know, essentially, how can we incorporate human rights as part of the negotiations with Iran? I hope I'm doing justice to your question, Mr. Allen. With the new administration in Washington, what are the chances that human rights advocates in Iran currently imprisoned for speaking out may be released? Well, this is a more pointed question. I guess obviously what you've done is you've raised the radar on the human rights activism in Iran and the perils and the dangers and the fate of the people who are imprisoned. Is there any chance that we could, part of the negotiation, we could free these? Alex, this is a question for you also.
I'll just say quickly that the previous administration in this country would mouth the words of human rights, but not because they really wanted human rights addressed in Iran, but because they wanted to create divisions and conflict and be destructive. It's a complicated process. I strongly believe in the nuclear accords. It was a disaster that the previous administration backed out of this complicatedly negotiated but highly revered process, and I don't think that Nasrin probably would have been arrested if they hadn't torn up our side of the accords. So I hope we can get back in. It's very complicated because there's elections coming up in Iran in just a few months, and so there's a very narrow timetable where we could do that. And yes, I strongly believe that human rights can be a part of that process. Not that you want to lard on so many things on a negotiation that becomes impossible to move forward, but there's no reason why you can't talk about limiting nuclear weapons and also advancing human rights at the same time. But if we're going to do that, then we also have to look at our own house and also and make sure that human rights in this country are respected, and not have efforts to block voting rights and to close Guantanamo and things like that. So I think it's a lot of things rising at the same time, but it'll make both our societies better.
Alex, do you agree with Jeff's assessment that if President Trump hadn't withdrawn from the JCPOA, Nasrin would have been free?
Well, to be honest, I have sympathy with how Jeff has arrived at that conclusion, but I don't know. I mean, I can only tell you, Nazee, that the Islamic Republic reacts in different ways, but it does react to pressure from the outside, depending on circumstances. So, I mean, on the broader point about human rights, look, I can put two hats on here. The Iranian diaspora hat that wants me to see a free Iran today, and then the one that puts his Iranian American hat on and says, you know what, human rights is a long-term endeavor. That will not happen overnight. I have a nuclear issue that Iran's working on that I need to deal with first. And I suspect that's what the Biden administration will do. Unfortunately, human rights will not be a big part of the conversation. That doesn't mean you can't have it at one point or another included in the conversation. But I don't think they're going to let the fears about a nuclear armed Iran sort of be, ignored by pushing the human rights agenda, which might scare the Iranian regime, I should say, to sort of, quit talking to the United States entirely. Look, the simple thing is this. When we talk about human rights, the Islamic Republic looks at that as an excuse and says, you're not really after human rights. You're after an instrument to come in, penetrate yourself into the society, and then from within bring it down, what they call color revolutions. We've seen that over the last few decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's their reading. They believe that the United States ultimately has the intention of bringing the regime down. And in that process of getting to that conclusion, they forget entirely about the anger of their own people, as if the United States magically can turn the sort of temperature up and make Iranian public anger. That's not America's doing. That's something that has happened as a result of policy of the Islamic Republic for the last 42 years. There are Iranian officials within the regime. Those of you who speak Farsi or read material coming from Iran know that there are people in the regime who openly say, we're on the wrong track. We got to stop. This is not going to go anywhere nice. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, at the moment you have this top figure at the top of the pyramid, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, He's going to be 82 in a few months' time. While he's around, I suspect nothing major will happen. But the people who will come after him, they will really have to look hard in the mirror and realize that, you know, this is not going to be the path forward. And it doesn't matter what the United States wants. It's what the Iranian people want. And they're sick and tired on all sorts of levels, politics, society, you name it. So that, I mean, that if you can, let me put it to you this way, and Nazee Jan, is in the summary. If the United States and allies in Europe and elsewhere can speed that process up, that decision-making process, make Iranian officials in the regime realize, you know, time is not on their side, that is in itself something good. But whether it's doable or not, that's a different matter.
Jeff, Marsha, do you think that there's a way to empower the dissidents, the Iranian women activists, without turning up the heat between Iran and America? How can we empower, let me phrase it this way, how can we empower the Nasrins of Iran?
Well, I think we can empower them, you know, by making sure that we speak of them a lot. I mean, and that people know what their work is, because I think Nasrin is a real role model. I think that's, you know, Alex, you know, one of the reasons I think she was also imprisoned was because, you know, these young women, you know, were really inspired by her, and that was very dangerous. They don't want, you know, all these young people, you know, trying to change the government, and she's a role model. And so by having international support, you know, and talking about her and having her name out there quite a lot in the news in these very positive ways, you know, she stays alive and her message stays alive, that, you know, that what she has to say cannot be defeated. And that, you know, they're not going to silence her. They won't silence her. She won't be silenced. She finds lots of ways, you know, to be not silenced. That horrible, very dangerous hunger strike she went on was, you know, 46 days. That was a form of her not being silenced in a way. She brought so much attention. And I think, you know, we keep talking about her and bringing more and more attention. And that then inspires other people to be fearless, like she is fearless.
Right. Well, keep her relevant and in the news.
Yes, yes.
Okay, we have 10 more minutes, more or less. I have one question from the audience, but because I promised that you can turn the tables on us, Jeff, go ahead and ask the question.
I just wondered, again, with the nuclear accord being negotiated, hopefully, although the Iranians recently said that they wouldn't be part of this European conversation, and then elections coming up in Iran in a few months, how did the two of you see the next few months and beyond playing out as far as Iranian rights and the connection between this country and Iran?
Alex?
Sorry. Well, look, I just comment on this part, Jeff, since you mentioned the elections. There's a lot of talk in this town right now in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere about, you know, time isn't on the side of those seeking a diplomatic solution. We need to talk to the Iranians while Rouhani is still in the presidential palace until June. I just don't buy that. And that's maybe because I've become too cynical. But the Islamic Republic has all its key strategic policies decided more or less, well, they say in the Supreme National Security Council, which is a body that brings in all sorts of powerful voices into one place where key decisions are made. But, you know, even if that is true, and I suspect a large amount of that is true, but that doesn't take away the fact that two entities in Iran decide key policies right now on the nuclear front. That is Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the generals from the Revolutionary Guards. And they are not elected by the people. Nobody votes for the Supreme Leader. He's sent there by God. That's the narrative. And the Revolutionary Guards are the protectors of God's messenger, and they don't run for office. And they have their own set of interests, political, economic, and in society, and they're not going to give away any power to any elected president. And we've seen that from this present Iranian President Hassan Rouhani to predecessor Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to Mohammad Khatami to Rafsanjani. No Iranian president has been able to make a big difference. Certainly when you say big difference, when Iranians go out, and I think the number that was in the Nasrin documentary was 72% came out and voted for Rouhani. I think it was 2013. What did they want? They want to avoid bloodshed. They want to avoid a revolution. They have this hope that maybe you can convince the ruling class that, you know, you got to make compromises. You got to give concessions to the public. Otherwise, it's going to get like Syria. It's going to get to be nasty. And we don't want that. So people do vote reluctantly, but the regime still doesn't give away anything. And right now, as we're talking about the June elections, the biggest fear in Tehran is humiliation at the ballot box, because nobody's going to show up this time. There's nothing to vote for. These elections are nothing but just give the world the illusion that Iran is run by a democratic system, which we all know is not the case.
I completely agree with Alex. I think your assessments were exactly right on. Jeff, I wanted to actually give kudos to you, because I tell you, I've watched this movie about 10 times, and I told you also that every time I watch it, I come away with something differently. I have become cynical, and I don't think there's such a thing as moderate or principlist or hardliner. I think they basically all answer to the same person, which is Khamenei at this point, regardless of how old is he, that the mindset of the regime is embodied by the Ayatollah, and whoever is next is going to be on the same continuum as Khamenei, as it has been. The kudos to you is when you were talking about the election of President Rouhani, you said moderate-backed President Rouhani instead of saying moderate President Rouhani, which is the misconception that the West has still to grapple with. In all his articulation, he hasn't talked about any moderation. He has a semblance of it, and if he's backed by the moderates, it's because of the lack of proper candidates to voice their dreams and aspirations. But in no way, shape, or form, he's a moderate. In actuality, if you go back to, I think, at the beginning of the revolution, he was one of the people who advocated for the hijab. And he said, and when the reporter told him that the Iranian women do not want the hijab, they won't wear it, he said, we will enforce it until they get used to it. And I don't know in what part of the world that would be considered a moderation. I agree with Alex on the fact that regardless of the presidency, the JCPOA, the Iranian meddling in the region, the kind of discounting the well-being of their own citizens for a broader Islamic agenda is part of the DNA of this regime. And the fallacy I see in this administration, the previous administrations, is that as Americans, we always tend to look for a solution. If we only did this better, if we only had not pulled out, come back in, all that the Iran is trying to prop up as an enemy. He's the great Satan. They're the imperialists. They're the ones that have spread that misery around the world. You need to go back only to Ayatollah Khomeini's, the leader of their Islamic revolution's original writings. I think it's the first paragraph that he says he blasts Israel and America as the source of evil around the world. And that's been continued down to this day, 42 years later. So I'm cynical. Unfortunately, I didn't start out as being cynical. I was one of the people that always said, if we had done this better, we would have been in a better place with Iran. I no longer think that way. Sorry to be on such a negative note. I hate to finish on a negative note. We have 4 minutes, and I wanted Jeff and Marsha to bring us back to the present. Where is Nasrin? Where is Reza? Can you elaborate? How are the children doing?
And you should mention the website.
Yeah, no, I want to, before we get to that, I just want to say for people who haven't seen the film, it's available on Amazon and iTunes. If you go to our website, nasrinfilm.com, you can find out exactly where you can see the film, and also in Canada. The other thing too is that the film on March 8th is going to become available internationally around the rest of the world on a streaming platform. So, on our website, nasrinfilm.com, there's lots of information, and you can find out where you can see the film. We, sign up for our newsletter. We update regularly, and we just encourage you to tell people about the film, share about the film, recommend the film. If you like the film, please recommend the film to your friends, because that's part of keeping Nasrin's message going. Jeff, you can say how they're doing because you spoke to Reza yesterday.
Yeah, we heard from Reza yesterday, but let me just say on that note of optimism versus pessimism, I'm an innately a cynical person, and the more you know about human behavior and history, the more cynical you get. And yet here is Nasrin, and in the most difficult circumstances you can imagine, she remains optimistic enough to keep fighting for human rights in Iran and putting herself on the line. And so if Nasrin can be optimistic, I will light a little candle inside myself to be optimistic too, and I hope you can also. The Iranian regime did sign the JCPOA. It was this country that backed out of it. That doesn't mean everything, but maybe there's just a glimmer of opportunity if we're lucky. As far as Nasrin's condition herself, Reza reported yesterday that she's in a cell that is approximately 8 feet by 13 feet big or small. It's windowless. The ceiling is very low. There are 12 beds in that cell in bunk beds, and she's sharing it with other women. She's allowed outside once a day. Garchak is renowned for having horrible conditions, urine-stained floors and bad water and horrible food and no medical care. If you've ever seen pictures inside it, it's just horrible.
It's the criminals, I mean, they've got 17 women on death row. A lot of women, that's what's happening there. But, they shut down, but the kids are doing okay. They're doing okay.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really doing okay. I mean, it's really, really hard, but they remain, in a very positive attitude.
Yeah, and everyone is getting active, signing petitions, encouraging support for human rights in Iran, advocating on behalf of Nasrin and others. As Alex and Nazee said, the regimes like that do pay attention to public pressure, and so keep the pressure up.
I mean, Nima said we should make a sequel of the film about everything that's happened since, since. I mean, but that's not happening. But this has been really, it's meant a lot to them.
Thank you. I will keep that candle on. You're absolutely right. Positivity is much better, and cynicism is healthy, but too much cynicism really is counterproductive. Alex, any closing remarks? Are you going to light a candle?
Well, I will, but I also want to thank you for agreeing to host this wonderful, important panel. Again, I want to thank Jeff and Marsha for this wonderful, compelling documentary. I really enjoyed it. I'll do my little part to spread the word. I hope we all will collectively, because it's a real good, important cause. And Iran that has a healthier society, including the 50% of the 85 million who are women. If we can get that right, that will have implications for the rest of the Middle East. I have no doubt about it. So that's another way of looking at it. And I mean, my last words is I really hope that Nasrin Soutoudeh will go back to her husband Reza and the children as soon as possible. I really genuinely hope that. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Nazee. Thank you for inviting us to join today.
Thank you.
And when you speak to Nasrin, please tell both of them, if you can, this is the only Persian movie that my family agreed to watch with me. And the discussion followed afterwards was worth an hour and a half of the complaints. But they were riveted by the movie, but then again, they had to kind of be focused back in. But I recommend it to everyone. It's worth watching, much to be hopeful for. And thank you, Jeff and Marsha. Thank you, Alex, for putting this together.
Thank you, Nazee.
Thank you,
so
everybody.
much. And thank you, Alex. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.